Hello and welcome to the World Built Environment Forum webinar series. My name is Fabrizio Varriale, and at today's webinar we will be discussing future urban centres in a post-pandemic hybrid working world, looking particularly at the role of the retail sector and how it interacts with public spaces and our sense of place. Pleased to say first that we've had over 550 registrations from over 30 countries from this webinar. Now we have a really great trio of panelists with us today. I will let them briefly introduce themselves before we start the discussion. Here we have Ted Liebman, Principal at Perkins Eastman and board members of the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization. Hi, Ted.
Hello. I'm an architectural designer and principal at Perkins Eastman, a global architectural firm with 24 offices worldwide. I teach a course on affordable housing at NYU, New York University, and work with a number of UN Habitat-related civil society non-governmental organizations to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs of UN Habitat. For the past half century, I've attended UN Habitat conferences and many world urban forums. I'm delighted to be with you all.
Thanks, Ted. I can't see you if you could turn on your screen unless there's a problem. But meanwhile, I'll introduce Bex Trevalyan, who's co-founder of Platform Places and Library of Things. Hello, Bex.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Yeah, so Platform Places is a cross-sector collaboration between councils, big asset owners and community leaders in the UK. And our mission is to unlock town centre buildings for amazing ideas that help us live affordably and sustainably and together. When we started Platform Places, or for my personal motivation to start it was because as an entrepreneur running Library of Things, a circular economy, social enterprise around London, I found it really difficult to access space in my local neighbourhood affordably, securely and in the long term. And so did actually nearly all of my peers with amazing ideas for arts and music venues, urban farms, reuse and repair hubs, wellbeing centres. And so this movement emerged out of this, realising we need to shift the way we do property in our town centre.
Thanks, Bex. And our third panelist is Tom Whittington, Director of Retail and Leisure Research at Savills. Hi, Tom.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. Yeah, I've been at Savills for 25 years, and I am a research analyst by trade, I guess. And probably the big journey for me was probably about 10 years ago when I realized that I was just constantly advising clients on the decline of retail, or the perceived decline of retail, rise of e-commerce and what that meant for shopping centre values. And actually I wanted to do something more positive. And when the department store story started to really decline, and we realized we'd started to need to think about talking about alternative uses for that space and trying to bring them back into existence and bring their investment values back, we embarked on a project called Reimagining Retail, which is a big cross-industry collaboration to bring people together to think about what we could do with those spaces. And we very quickly realized that the things that we were talking about were just as relevant for retail places, not just shopping centres and department stores. And so we did a big piece on this, thinking about all those alternative uses, which I'm sure we'll talk about in this conversation. And then we quickly realized that actually it wasn't just about economic sustainability, it was about environmental sustainability. So I've kind of moved forwards in my career, I suppose, from talking very polarized in terms of retail trends to actually thinking about the future of retail spaces and what that means to consumers and to investors.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you all very much for being here with us. We prepared a set of interesting questions for you, but I just want to remind the audience that you can send your own questions to our panelists, which does really help to bring the conversation to life. Now, if you're new to these webinars, you should see that you can submit these questions at any time using the question box, which is on your screen in the little panel. We will try and pick up as many as we can while we go through the session. And now we start the discussion with the first of our questions, which is following the growth of online shopping and the impact on the pandemic, and now the move to hybrid working, what do you say is the current state of health of retail and retail centers and real estate in urban centers? Maybe Tom, you want to answer this?
Yes, so it is quite a complex question, and I think it's one that's worth giving a little background to. Firstly, we're always talking about what the post-pandemic environment is. The pandemic accelerated various trends, but it didn't invent many trends. A lot of the things that have happened were already in existence, and actually were probably going to happen anyway, but it's definitely brought things into light. The second thing is that this conversation really needs to be about urban centres and places, but it kind of starts with retail. And the reason it starts with retail is because we've spent the last 50 years as urban practitioners creating retail-only places. And part of the journey that we're on now is moving back to a more blended existence. But because they are retail-only places, that is kind of where we have to start in terms of their purpose. And so that starts with consumers, because ultimately they are the customers. If you can't get the customers fulfilled, there is no investment value, there's no drive for development or anything like that. So consumers are increasingly blended. They want to be fulfilled online and offline. A cost has an impact on every single retail transaction they make, whether it's a financial cost or a time cost. We're increasingly agile, whether that's through agile working or just simply wanting to be fulfilled wherever we are at any particular time. We're increasingly green, but don't necessarily want to pay for it. And experience underlines everything that any of those people do, and that's quite key when it comes to thinking about retailers and tenants and the fulfillment that they're able to do, because retailers are very focused on getting money in at the tills and not necessarily very quick in adapting to these consumer changes. They're having to stay relevant. They've got the balance of e-commerce. They're having to think about whether they're located in or out of town. They're thinking about the challenges around occupational costs, particularly post-COVID. That has been a real challenge, challenges around staffing. So there's all these immediate challenges that the property market and its tenants are playing with, and that often prevents them from seeing the big picture about what retail places could actually be. And that's quite important. In terms of retail places, most places tended to try to be what we might call retail destinations, attracting people from long distance, trying to have the best retailers, trying to have the best leisure. So what do we mean by retail destinations? Experiential, mainly comparison goods, lots of indulgent spend, occasionally visited and often more premium goods. In actual fact, most places need to be thinking more about community and convenience, serving a local catchment, being more functional, selling essential goods where people visit frequently and they possibly have a more value-orientated offer. And those designations of place are absolutely fundamental to the reasons that we've had challenges in the way that we have. So if you look at convenience goods and you look at grocery stores and you look at retail parks, they're all doing absolutely brilliantly. It's all of the locations that we're trying to do the more destinational piece that are having to reflect. And there's some quite interesting data post-COVID where we look at footfall before and after. As I said, some of these trends are accelerating, and we've seen a large number of towns that were seeing quite significant footfall before the pandemic are now much more streamlined to a much lower footfall, on average down by about 30 to 40%. That's quite significant. That doesn't mean necessarily that the spend is going down by the same amount, because we're seeing a more sort of purposeful full spend, but those challenges are quite significant. Okay, so that is inevitably having an impact on vacancy, and it's having an impact on relevance, and particularly for major stakeholders of those places thinking about future proofing and how we keep those places relevant going forwards. There has been plenty of resilience. This isn't just a negative story. Food and beverage and leisure have been doing particularly well post-COVID. Always been good in the background, but I think that the impact of being locked down for so long has meant that consumers have kind of adapted to the way that they want to spend, and these things have become more essential in terms of the way that they want to spend. So we've got to think about that in terms of our placemaking. Convenience has done very good. Prime high streets at the other end of the scale are really bouncing back, but their pitches are a lot smaller. And if they've got smaller pitches, you've got more sort of secondary space that we need to think about adapting to. So plenty of failure, plenty of renewal. And one thing I often say about retail is the only change is the only constant in retail. So I'm not saying that retail is dead, but it does need to stay relevant. And in the UK, we've got 150 million square feet of vacant floor space. 40% of that is long-term empty, arguably redundant. And about by the end of the decade, we reckon that's going to be about 25% of all retail that is no longer relevant. That's a significant challenge going forwards. Again, as I say, it's all nuanced. Retail parks, quite a lot of retail parks have almost got no vacant units at all. And then we've got shopping centres that have closed their doors for the last time. And then everything in between, up and down the country, and this isn't just the UK, there is probably very, very few places that have actually got everything right. Most places have got to kind of think about some form of adapting. So we've got major amounts of space that needs to be repurposed. And that brings us on to the topic of repurposing, which I'll try and be ever so brief on. The idea is about relevance, it's about mixed use, it's about bringing in alternative uses that complement the retail, that help right size the retail. It allows for expanding the footfall. It allows for cross-pollination of footfall, so thinking about uses that complement one another and get people actually feeding off each other. So, you know, F&B and office workers is an obvious example. And it's about extending parts of the day, because so many locations have just got a very busy particular part of the day, whether it's daytime or in the evening. We need to kind of expand that. So the story of repurposing is growing. Back in 2019, in the UK, it was hardly anything. And at that time, when we found it as being quite a big deal in the UK, we talked about this with our European colleagues, and they were kind of, in many ways, they didn't have the same challenges that we had then. But I can tell you now that post-COVID, a lot of our European colleagues are seeing some of the same challenges going forwards. If we go over to the US, and I'm sure Ted can add to this shortly, back in the year 2000, they had about 2,500 shopping centres, and the consensus now is that they only need about 750. In the UK, we've got over 800, and the US has got 5 times the population that we have. So there are significant changes that are going to happen. What I really like about the US story is they're 2 decades ahead, and there's some great examples of repurposing that have genuinely been delivered, because in the UK, so many projects, but so few have actually been around or have actually been delivered yet for us to say exactly how well they've gone. So that's broadly the state of things as we see it.
Thanks, Tom. We have a follow-up on this, but I'm not sure if Ted or Bex want to quickly come in or add anything. Then I can move on. So Tom, I think you mentioned experiential retail. How would you define it, and how do you think it's how important it is in revitalizing the local retail environments?
Experience is everything. Now, the property industry tends to think about experience or experiential as major shopping centres or big leisure schemes, and it is that. Absolutely, it is that, and those kind of schemes have increasingly become more leisure orientated, and actually much the big revival that we're seeing in some of our major prime centres is leisure, where some of the retail is struggling. But I would argue that experience is absolutely every layer. If a consumer, whatever it is they're engaging with, has a bad experience, whether it's going into a bank or going into a grocery store or going to the cinema or going to a restaurant, if they have a bad experience, they're unlikely to want to do that again. So experience is absolutely everything. So it depends whether we're talking about experience from a conceptual sort of offering, or whether experience in terms of how that person feels about that particular place. Now, that can be quite emotive. It could be just down to service, but actually it can also be down to environment. And I know that's something that we're going to go on to talk to in due course. So I would say that experience is everything at every single layer, all the way down the property hierarchy, the town hierarchy.
Thanks, Tom. And linking on to this, the experience is obviously something that can attract people or repel people, as you said. We do have a question particularly for Ted, which is, how do you think that thriving retail and urban centers influence the city's ability to retain and attract talent in a world which has been made smaller by ease of travel and also more competitive than ever, where cities compete for talents?
Indeed, large, medium, and even small cities all have potential to be either successful or they may decline and fail. That's happening a lot in the United States, especially with old industrial cities. All cities today are in competition to be successful. In 2024, now every city is now in competition globally because everywhere is no more than a day away. So it took my grandfather over 5 weeks to come to the United States from Kyiv, Ukraine. Today, one of the greatest issues globally is brain drain. In Krasnoyarsk, Russia, and Toledo, Ohio, and cities in your country are examples of thousands of cities losing young people, leaving for higher education or better jobs worldwide, and never returning home. Airplanes now take the Krasnoyarsk student not to Moscow or St. Petersburg as it did a half century ago, but to London or Tokyo or Boston or anywhere. What can keep people at home or to return home? If a city has good health care, actually it must have good health care, teaching hospitals, good education, universities, new thinking universities, good air and water, good culture, arts and music, good parks and recreation, people care about health, good food. Basically, the elements that make a successful city also make places that keep people there or bring people back. Retail is an essential part of that formula. Retail is a very big word. It contains places that range from food, clothing, pharmacies, business centers, furniture, and community services for recreation, health, and wellness. Retail provides security on the street. Retail requires access and inclusion for all people and hopefully welcomes them all in our multicultural world.
Thanks, Ed. Continuing on the importance of the retail in the urban centers, gonna then maybe turn to Bex, if you can talk about how that is important in terms of not just for the business, but for the local communities and the residents that live in the area.
Sure. Obviously, town centres, urban centres are at their heart a place to meet, right? To gather, to exchange goods and services, sure, to create, but ultimately, who are they for? What are they for? Primarily, people who live there to come together, build relationships, and feel like they belong and meet their needs. And of course, people who are visiting from nearby, from further afield. But primarily, these urban centres have to serve those who live there. And I'm interested in our language around this, how we move beyond seeing people who live in a place as consumers, right, as people who have a transactional relationship with the place, towards citizens who have perhaps a transformational and participatory relationship with the place. And so I think the places I see thriving are those that understand that and center the citizens, local people in the making of the place. And an example I'll give is one I've admired for a while, and I work with. It's Nudge Community Builders in Plymouth. The story starts about 5 or 6 years ago with a high street called Union Street in a deprived high street with high vacancy. People living nearby felt a sense of, I don't feel safe walking down this high street. I don't necessarily want to be there. I don't want to dwell there. And what was happening in the meantime was a local group, Stonehouse Action Group, a local residents group organized by Hannah and Wendy, local residents, came together and said, what if we take on that first building and start unlocking a little bit of space on the street just for us to hold events. And they started to do this. They attracted artists. They created a mural on one wall on the street. They raised funds and bought a pub that stood empty for several years in the middle of the high street, transformed it into a thriving marketplace for a mix of social enterprises, local radio, health and wellbeing services, black-led food, startups, and upstairs affordable housing. They transformed it and suddenly started to create life and vibrancy and safety on the street, and a sense of, hey, we can bring our skills and energy and participate here. And from there, because there was so much kind of demand and need for this, and local people responded so well, they've then gone on to buy or long lease 4 more buildings on the street. I forget the total, but it's in the tens of thousands of square meters that they're activating, dozens of local jobs, hundreds of new thriving organizations created, skills sharing opportunities, and ultimately thousands of people now who live in the area now visiting, feeling safe. There's color and life everywhere, murals, artists, street festivals, parties, and it's a real tangible difference to the place. So I think that framing of the residents as citizens and participants, active participants, rather than just there to consume, I think that shapes everything in how we make our places.
Thanks, Beck. That's actually a great example. Been to Plymouth some years ago. I don't know if Tom or Ted would like to add anything to this.
Well, I think what I take from this is, and again we see this in the repurposing story, it's the pioneers that we can bring into certain spaces that really kind of bring something to life, and they kind of create a bit of traction. One of my favourite repurposing projects is in Sheffield. It's Commune. It's an ex-department store, and they brought in a food hall, so that creates a vibrancy of people. It's all about activation on the street level, but they also have a co-working space. Now, okay, that's just 2 uses that could be brought into many places, but the important message was that the result on the surrounding streets was that vacant units were suddenly finding they had demand for them again. Similarly, in Altrincham, edge of Manchester, Altrincham Market, took a tired market, created this street food scene, and now, I mean, that whole area is completely different. I mean, it's one of the coolest areas of Manchester, and a lot of the young people now want to be located there because they're getting forced out of the city centre. Slightly different issue about prices of residential. So we do see some great regeneration that starts with these kind of, whether they're directly community projects or projects that inspire the community to want to engage in them. It's really important. The other thing I was going to mention is about urban living, because urban living is a big part of what we need to do within urban centres. And we're getting better and better at building big blocks of some form of residential unit. But what we're not very good at doing is building a cross-generational range of places for people to live. And so what we're kind of doing is creating places that are exclusive for certain generations. They'll live there for a bit, they'll have a great time, there's probably a good bar scene, but there's going to come a point where those people then move on to create families. And what we really need to do is to create places that people want to be across the generational piece. So we need schools, we need places to hang out, we need healthcare and all those bits and pieces. That's really, really key from a community level as well.
I'd like to just mention the changing demographics that are happening in our cities, and Beck's, your examples show that. Today, in our cities and neighborhoods, COVID made some permanent changes in our living habits. Many of us work at home part-time, and our neighborhood convenience centers now need to sell paper and ink for our printers. Demographics itself, in my city, New York, 1/3 of our households are single-person households. 1/4 of the households are adults not related, living together. And in 2014, only 17% were 2-parent families with a child under 24 years of age. How must retail change to keep up with these very dramatic changes? This presents us with both enormous challenges, but incredible opportunities to enhance all of our communities.
Thanks, Ted. I think what both Bex and Tom particularly mentioned kind of preempted our next question, which was about repurposing. And maybe we can expand a bit more on that, which is how can we, or also what are kind of particularly the challenges of repurposing what are the traditional retail spaces towards then making them providing community hubs and services that increases the appeal to the local community. Don't know, Bex, if you have some other good examples.
There's one more example I'll mention that I love, and I like yours, Tom, as well, in Sheffield and Altrincham. But there's one in Bristol in southwest UK, where the two organisations that were local, called Artspace Lifespace and Global Goals Centre, took on an old M&S building right in the city centre. An old Marks and Spencer, and they worked with local people to co-design how this would look and feel, to design the experience. And what they've created with the enormous floor space that there is lots of different departments. They've riffed on the idea of the department store, and they now have a department for imagination, a department for nature, where there's an urban garden and oasis. They show inspiring films about nature. There's a department for energy, where you can come along for fuel poverty advice or advice about your energy efficiency in your home. You can chat to Bristol Energy Cooperative, who are based there. And I think what's interesting about what they've done is they haven't said, right, we ourselves as two organisations need to activate this entire space ourselves, but they've partnered with hundreds of organisations to do that activation. So, and they very much position them as partners rather than tenants. So for the Department for Energy, for example, they are the lead activating organisations are Bristol Energy Cooperative and the Centre for Sustainable Energy, and it's sponsored by a local bank, Trevalyan Bank, that support sustainable energy projects. So they're really working in a very collaborative partnership way, which is, I think, indicative of the spirit that we need to see more and more as we're reinventing, repurposing these spaces. So it's all about like local ecosystems and collaboration. I think what's interesting is what are the barriers to starting that kind of thing? Why isn't that happening everywhere? That's a question I like, and I think the two big barriers that I've seen are perhaps three. The lack of access to the owners, the landlords. So finding that route through as a local organisation can be difficult. And being taken seriously as a credible organisation can be difficult. So there's something about building those bridges and local relationships between the ultimate owners of the spaces, bringing the landlords to the table and having hard incentives, carrots and sticks to do that. I think then funding the repurposing obviously is a challenge, particularly the revenue funds. So the funds for the organising and the partnership building behind the scenes before capital works can happen, but capital too, of course. And then I think, yeah, collaborating with local authorities, community organisations, local businesses often will say that's a challenge. The council could and should be doing more. But I think, yeah, building those really constructive collaborations are important. And I think in Liverpool, there's some really good examples of that happening, where the local authority is seeing themselves as an enabler and a platform for community organisations, have built long-term partnerships, and have separately, an organisation called Kindred has started as a real grassroots-led funder and investor in socially trading organisations, as they call them, in the city, which is really providing that funding and bringing down that barrier. I'll leave it there.
Great example. Thanks. Don't know, maybe Tom, you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, I think it's useful to think about different kinds of uses. I absolutely endorse all the things that Bex is talking about. There are other more sort of tangible asset classes that still benefit communities, such as health centres or education or civic centres. So they're also really important from a community perspective. So in Walthamstow, Upper Mall of a shopping centre has been converted to a health centre. Of course, the benefits of that is it's taking tired space, it's bringing people in throughout the day, and it's providing an important service to the community. The Debenhams in Gloucester is being converted to a university faculty. One of the South London councils is, and I can't mention which one, but is currently owns a shopping centre and is currently their big priority to bring in a civic centre. So there can also be quite big sort of tangible property uses as well, which are also important. I think the other thing we have to remember from a community perspective is there is nothing more detrimental to the way that people feel about their places than empty shops. So street activation, whether it's an active use like the sort that Bex has talked about, great example, which is ultimately bringing that use back into play. And so even people that aren't using that play get this kind of almost sort of secondary emotion from it as they walk past. And then street activation is the idea that a use might not be relevant to a particular person in the community, but there's this idea of a crowd draws a crowd draws a crowd. Busy places feel more vibrant, they feel safer, and we are sort of, you know, we're sort of social animals. So if you can kind of create that activation that brings people in, then it kind of almost has a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of helping with other things as well.
Great, Ted, would you like to add something, or should I move on to the next question?
Let's move on.
Yeah, okay, sure. Maybe it kind of links to what Tom was saying, but I'll ask you, Ted, because it's a very architecture topic, and the question is, how do we create a sense of place in our urban centers? And I guess especially when there is not already a sense of place. So probably not looking at the very iconic places or the places that everybody know, but those that are run down, that having some problem in being identified.
Tom just said we're all social animals. And truth is, once we leave our home, my small apartment, I enter a public realm. I meet people, I see people. And now, after COVID especially, connections with people are important for our mental health as well as our lives. So let's always integrate our immense global issues that we face: climate change, migration, let's have real community engagement and participation as we rethink our communities and urban centers. This is where equity, equality, inclusion, rethinking our multicultural world, these are all important issues to understand as we attempt to reimagine our retail. Today, we have immense new opportunities. AI and new technology are innovating our world at an exponential rate. I listen to people at MIT Lab in Massachusetts and Cornell Tech in New York, and they've created new thinking incubators for new companies, laboratories for innovation. Reimagining retail has the opportunity to innovate as an incubator, a laboratory, to make our urban environment, our 15-minute walking cities, our urban life more livable and sustainable. There's a Sustainable Development Goal 11 on my button that says, number 11 says, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And in a sense, we have an enormous new opportunity because retail cannot remain as it was. People have changed, our activities have changed, where we go on an hourly basis and daily basis have changed dramatically. And let's just think out and have people tell us by participating what we should do to make our communities better. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed.
Can I add to that, Fabrizio?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think the public realm piece is really important, and also culture, which have both been brought up, but I just want to sort of provide a slightly different context to them. Public realm is almost too easy a phrase to use, and we need to think about what it actually means. We're not just talking about open spaces, they've got to be usable spaces. Mayfield in Manchester, big development there, has built the first public park in the city for, God, a century, I think it is. So that's about creating a tangible space that people can live and play and breathe in. The council in Stockton-upon-Tees, which is in the north of England, they bought the Castlegate shopping centre that lost value of about 80% of its value. They bought it, they're knocking it down, and that seems quite an extreme solution. But what they recognise is if they knock it down and build a public park and create the environment that people want to be in, then they're more likely to get people that want to live and work in that town, and then the rest of the pieces of the economics and the retail then follows from that. So sometimes some of these initiatives might be quite extreme, but there is a good economic rationale. All the big schemes I can think of in Manchester, my home city, have a big cultural icon that relates to them, and that's about giving something back to the community. It's about creating identity and brand of that development site, and it is creating that engagement and pride that people then have in that place. So, I think about the last 10 years in Manchester, we've got twice as many food and beverage outlets that we had 10 years ago. We've got about 5 new huge venues that have come in. So all of this has helped growing that sense of place, both for the people of Manchester, but also on a global stage that points to Ted's piece about needing to be relevant if you're going to attract people to live and work there. So placemaking and culture, absolutely fundamental.
Mixing cultures is terribly important as well. In a multicultural world, even our communities, welcoming people of different incomes and ages and making that places accessible in that way, places to sit and relax and watch are also terribly important. And that provides security as well. So we are changing, and I think that retail, in a sense, is one of those that has one of the greatest opportunities to be a real force in making that change, make our cities more livable.
Thanks, Ted. Bex, do you want to add anything onto that? Or I might...
I've spoken to that. It's all good.
Yeah, indeed. I wanted to pick up a couple of things that came in the chat from the audience. So there was a comment from Katie, and they actually link. Katie is saying that she's working for the NHS, and that's the National Health Services for those who don't live in the UK. And they paired with the local city council to construct a community diagnostic center in the urban centers. And she's saying that similar centers are being built across the country, and then there's also hoping that as these centers, the medical centers, raise the activity in the area, then it brings some footfall back into the city centers, and then also easing the congestion on the hospital side. And then another member of the audience, Mike, is asking, so he's interested in bringing healthcare into the high street, which is what we're saying. The high street is how we call the city center, the main street in the city center in the UK. It does, as Mike says, help regenerate the city center, but also it helps the NHS find suitable premises that can be converted. But the problem, as is pointing out, is the NHS funding constraint versus the retail landlords. They're obviously motivated by profit, which are obviously those things might not necessarily match. And he's asking the panel, what do you think, how we might overcome this issue?
We are seeing that becoming overcome in places, either through councils buying up large tranches of shopping centres, which we've seen quite a lot of over the last couple of years. We've also seen retail landlords, particularly those who've got a large amount of space, become much more flexible in terms of the uses that they bring in. And without wanting to get overly technical on it, the average retail lease nowadays is about 3 to 5 years. an NHS or a hospital are likely to sign 25 to 30 years plus, possibly longer. So there's an important point from a landlord's perspective, an investor's perspective, about having a long-term guaranteed rent payer, even if that rent has to be reduced. And let's not forget that in the UK, over the last 7 years, we've had a rent rebasing of an average of about 22%, up to 30% in some markets. So that is certainly helping, and it is definitely one of the solutions. The other thing, picking up on your first point as well, actually, it was interesting. But if we think about the way that we used to work pre-COVID, Ted mentioned about the 15-minute neighborhood. You know, we'd wake up, we'd drive or get the train to a place of work. We'd work in the office all day if we work in an office, or we'd work in a warehouse all day. We'd never leave it, and then you drive maybe somewhere else to go out, and then you drive home. And of course, that's 3 different locations. That's not very sustainable. And because there isn't that interconnectivity, you don't have an affinity in any of those particular locations. So if you bring those things together, you do create that affinity. And actually, the really important thing from a sustainability perspective, from a transportation perspective, you bring more of those uses together, there's less reason to travel to lots of different places, and that's great for the air, that's great for our carbon targets, and so on. So yeah, it's all positive.
I should mention 2 things. One, travel and cars. I haven't had a car since 1977. I don't need it in New York. I use public transit. I walk. I think our 15-minute cities in the future are going to bring people together, living, working together closer. And I believe that this is essential in the future. And the car is, in a sense, an enemy of connections and people's health. On healthcare itself, our firm does a lot of healthcare, and the experience of just entering a hospital or clinic, what you feel, that you're going to a clean, welcoming place that heals, is terribly important. The psychology of rooms in hospitals that see outdoors and nature heal people faster. The healing process can be part of the whole experience, and there's a lot of bio-thinking that goes into this, and it really is a study now that we should bring to retail when we integrate health-related facilities or community facilities for health and wellness.
That's a good point, Ted. Before we move on to our question, there was a question from Kate in the audience, and she also recognized there may not be entirely in scope, but I think it's interesting because we're talking about this and we're kind of seeing a lot of the positives, but also there's some harsh realities that we need to deal with. And Kate is asking, what is the impact on urbanization, but I guess also changes within the urban fabric on housing affordability, because as she says, it's difficult for people to appreciate these reimagined spaces when in those in the area that are unattainable just because of economic reason. You know, particularly we know in the UK rents are rising very much. Housing cost generally is rising very much. So is there maybe an issue of imagining very attractive places, but then these places becoming livable only for those who can afford it? And how do we bring that attraction to the places that you know, that are more affordable because they might be outside of the city centre?
I'll speak to that. Yeah, it's a massive issue, and I personally have lived variously in Brixton in South London 10 years ago, and Deptford in South London, and Totnes in Devon, and all 3 of those places have undergone immense gentrification and displacement. And I've been a you know, in rental housing all of that time, like 35% of the UK population, and the rents have gone up, well, way more than doubled, and in that space. And it's such a critical challenge for any kind of urban centre redevelopment, is how do you make sure people who live here can stay here and continue to be part of this. And I think if you have to address both in tandem. I happen to live in a housing cooperative in Lewisham that's been there since 1974. The rents were £250 per month all in. What it meant was that everybody there was able to volunteer their time, get involved in their neighbourhood. There were artists, musicians, and because people didn't have that rising rent pressure. Where I'm living now, there are some of those schemes that are being brought forward. So I think we absolutely have to support housing affordability through community-led cooperatives, through developer-led affordable housing schemes, through rent caps. I think we have to talk about that, because otherwise we have a massive social justice issue, and yeah, particularly marginalised and underserved communities get pushed out inevitably.
Definitely what we're seeing in Manchester, it is a big problem. The residential properties that we're bringing to Manchester are in many ways great. We've got 25,000 new homes that will be within a stone's throw of the city centre within a sort of 15-year period, and that's having an immense impact on the culture and the F&B that we talked about. But we do have to be careful about talking about gentrification, but we even have to be careful to talk about the needs of even the young professionals that live in Manchester and that work in Manchester and want to live there, and they're getting forced out as well. There was some analysis done recently that kind of calculated that basically in order for those properties in the city to be affordable, they needed to be 3 or 4 bedroom apartments so that you could accommodate flat shares, but we're only building 1 or 2 bedroom places. So there is an affordability issue, but there's also the type of property that we're building. Some of the positive consequences of this, and you might say it's a negative, I suppose, if people are being forced out, but what we are actually also then seeing is a sort of renewed regeneration in some of Manchester's satellite towns that are improving, that have been quite a rundown for quite a few decades. So there is increased demand now for people that want an urban type of life that can then find those opportunities. I mentioned Altrincham before. It's a great example of one that we're seeing. I guess where we have to be careful is if we look at this in another 20 years' time, will we look back and say, yes, but they've now become unaffordable, and where do the people go? So definitely a balance. Aren't enough affordable housing, and actually we need to think about what affordable is, because it isn't a certain percentage below the maximum house value. It is what can people genuinely afford as a proportion of their income, at whatever level of income that might be.
Thanks, Tom. Ted, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, or otherwise I might move on. So we had a couple of questions for the end, unless there's anything else from the audience. And I thought of some points that have been touched already, so I might merge the two. The next question was asking, how can we best meet the economic needs of retail while achieving our sustainable goals for urban centre? But then the next question would ask, in a similar vein, if you could offer a couple of pieces of advice for revitalising the retail spaces in the urban centres quickly and cost effectively, while also achieving or contributing to our sustainable goals, which may be environmental as well as social. What would you say? What would you recommend? What would you point as a kind of lighthouses in this space? I might ask to who wants to answer first.
I'll have a go. So particularly thinking about sustainability and economic needs and social equity, I really recommend the donut economic framework that the City of Amsterdam has picked up and run with, that gives a really good way of prioritizing kind of planetary boundaries and making sure everyone is operating within the finite limits, and also making sure that nobody falls through the middle of the donut and isn't able to meet their needs. So I think it's a really good overarching framework from which you can design places, ensure everyone's needs are met, whilst really centering sustainability and ecological health. So I think that's one really useful framework, and Civic Square in Ladywood in Birmingham are doing really interesting work applying that in that area of Birmingham as well. Recommend their latest report called 3 Degree Neighbourhood. It's really sobering, but also really inspiring in many ways. Really recommend it. Co-written with Dark Matter Labs. The other thing I would recommend to reimagine and revitalise retail spaces, urban centres quickly, I've said it before, but just bringing together those different stakeholders around a dinner table, ideally, to build trust, so that landlords are sitting with the NHS, with councils, with community leaders in partnership to say, what does this place need? How do we use our collective assets to make that happen? And if those relationships are in place, we can move quickly and cost effectively from there.
Thanks, Bex. Ted, I see you're ready.
On zoning itself, we often zone our cities to segregate. We separate industrial from housing, create centers for business. All of that has to change. Each city must have mixed use almost everywhere, because we live and work together. And retail becomes one of the connectors to make our streets safer and to make our first level more active 24 hours a day. And open space is terribly important. When we go to the water's edge, we can't think of just correcting now the water's edge for climate change with natural methods, but we have to think of under the water and agriculture and urban agriculture. And all of this becomes can become part of retail as well, and can be part of the health and wellness of people, because people like looking at this. So at the water's edge, you could have fish breeding at the water's edge. You could have restaurants serving fish, and you can have oysters being developed below grade with seaweed for food. And this becomes business. So business and culture can come there, and in the open space that's created. So, and education as well. So everything should come together. I should probably stop because of our time.
It's okay, Ted. We have some time left. Tom, I think.
So I'll pick up on the sustainability piece as well, because we're doing some interesting work around obviously the occupational challenges that I mentioned at the beginning, but also things like the MEES regulations and thinking about how we decarbonise our high street. Now, I don't want to get too technical for the case of this conversation, but the MEES regulations and the EPC regulations, in theory at least, mean that 83% of UK retail floor space cannot be leased from 2030. Now, we know that those regulations are going to shift, but it's quite useful for articulating how far we've got to go. That's 140 million square meters of retail floor space that needs upgrading. It's 50 to 90 billion pounds in terms of cost to upgrade it. Now, why am I mentioning this? Well, I'm mentioning it because at one part, we're hearing in our heads that we've got to sort out these MEES regulations, we've got to sort out the carbon usage within those buildings. And on the other side, we're talking about repurposing and the needs to think about that use and whether it's a retail one. If we don't bring those two problems together, we're going to make a mess of it, because there's no point upgrading a property to be the greenest, cleanest property if it should not be that use. That's absolutely fundamental. So thinking about repurposing and its environmental performance is absolutely fundamental from a sustainability point. So that's the message I want to put out on there. Bex also mentioned stakeholders, and stakeholders are absolutely fundamental as well. I think the question included something about how do we get urban centres quickly, change them quickly and cost effectively. Nothing is quick. I'm sorry to break it to you, but nothing is quick. So we've got to be patient. And this often, from a stakeholder and investment perspective, does require a bit of a long game. We're not going to fix it in 5-10 years, but we need to be on the right journey. And it's about being bold. So what we often find when I'm working with councils is that they are broadly accepting that change is required, but they're also very protective of what they have, and arguably sometimes too protective. So a particular project I've been working on recently, a major city centre shopping centre that's being repurposed. It's currently got 300,000 square feet of retail floor space. It's going to have about 100,000 square feet of retail floor space. And the council question to us was, who's going to be occupying the department store when you finish the development? Now, it's very easy for me as a retail analyst to bang my head against the table at that point, but what you have to remember is that not everybody is seeing that whole journey. The way my perception on the world is that there isn't a department store. There isn't going to be a large retail occupier. There isn't going to be a large retail anchor for that place. And all the things that we've been talking about in this conversation about community uses, workspaces, residential, all those things are really positive use for that retail space. So we have to try and work together with those stakeholders and educate and reassure that what we're trying to do is to create something beneficial, future looking, that's going to really work for that community, but it might not be what it is now, because current planning is all about protecting what we currently have. And that is important, but it can be restrictive.
Of course. We're nearly the end of our time. There were a couple of questions that came in from the audience. One was asking Bex particularly to elaborate more on the downside of gentrification, and this could be another webinar. Maybe Bex, you can say a couple of things, maybe point to a resource that that's out there.
Oh, it's a massive one. Yeah. I guess I would talk to, if we had more space and time, I would talk to two levels, like how it feels for the families, the communities, the individuals experiencing gentrification and not being able to afford to stay in a place, to run a business in a place, to live there, and the uprooting feeling of that, particularly for marginalized communities. And then what's happening behind the scenes, which we don't see, which is where the wealth and power is fundamentally lying. So I would look at community wealth building as an alternative approach and mindset for how we do inclusive, long-term, equitable placemaking. Thanks, Beck. That might be a good idea for another webinar. There was another question from the audience. I might ask Tom maybe to give a couple of words on this. And they were asking if regeneration of city spaces, as in parks and recreation, can that compensate for office space and retail space? And I think they're guessing that parks and recreation might not, provide the same revenue or than an office space and a retail space where there's like a lot of concentrated floor area. Don't know if Tom, if you have something in mind.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a fair point, and I think that's one of the challenges that the current landlords have in terms of effectively wiping off that asset value. The Mayfield development that I think I mentioned earlier, First Public Park, that is part of a much bigger scheme that has a significant amount of office and residential. So actually, this park, you could say, was a gift to the community in order to enable the rest of that development while providing a better quality space for that environment. Where we see the Stockton upon Tees example, you've got a council, they can take that long-term view, so that and they do have access to other forms of funding. Seeing a similar thing in Nottingham, where the Broadmarsh shopping centre is earmarked for in part for a public park, marshland as well, but it has to be part of a bigger scheme, because at the end of the day, we've got to try and get the balance right between meeting the needs of investors and developers, without which these things wouldn't happen, but doing it right and ethically and with a long-term vision.
Great, Tom. I think that was a great way of combining those two aspects. So we are reaching the end of our time slot. I would like to thank you very much, Bex, Tom, and Ted for being here today. Before I close, I would like to remind the audience that we will publish a recording and a written summary of this webinar online. Please feel free to share those with your professional networks. Also, please take a few moments to let us know what you thought of today's session by completing the online poll, which will appear on your screen at the end of the webinar. Should also be able to see in a moment that there's a few very interesting webinars upcoming with our WBEF series. If you need any further information, please search rcs.org/WBEF or just Google World Built Environment Forum on Google, or you can search us on LinkedIn as well. Thanks again to our panelists. Thanks very much, Bex, Tom, and Ted. Thank you all for attending this webinar, and until next time, goodbye.